Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, Coffee and Cartridges. Today we're going to talk about rifle cartridge case design. I'm going to give my top 5 most influential case designs and then kind of give you some personal favorite picks of mine. So stay tuned. All right, this can kind of be a tricky subject because you could give credit to multiple cartridges as being the parent case of another cartridge. So let's say I was bragging about a lot of the Weatherby cartridges. Well, most of them came from the 300 H&H, but also the 300 H&H came from the 375 H&H. So which one of those two gets the credit? The Nosler cartridges are all kind of based on the Rum cartridges, just a little bit shorter, a few minor differences. But the Rum cartridges kind of get their inspiration from the Jeffrey, the 404 Jeffrey. So there's always different ways to look at it. Even the 30-06 lineage, really, if you wanted to, you could say it came from the 7mm Mauser, because that spawned the 30-06. Or you could actually go back, just keep going back further and decide what spawned the 7mm Mauser. So when talking about the most influential case designs of all time, it's not really cut and dry, it's not straightforward, and it's really just a matter of opinion. But that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to give you a few honorable mentions. So 416 Rigby, it definitely spawned some other big game cartridges, including all the Weatherby cartridges based off the 378 Weatherby. All comes from the 416 Rigby. A more modern one, the 375 Ruger. You know, basically your 338 RCM, your 300 RCM, your 65 PRC, your 7mm PRC, and your 300 PRC all come from that 375 Ruger. So it's definitely bringing about some great cartridges. And then to a smaller degree, the 30TC, you know, it spawned the 6.5 Creedmoor, the 6mm Creedmoor. And I'm pretty certain in the next few years we're going to have a 25 Creedmoor and a 22 Creedmoor. And so, you know, 15, 20 years from now, you might look back and think of how influential that 30TC case was. Another one that is very influential is the 404 Jeffrey. Basically, the WSMs, the Psalms, the Noslers, and the Rums all get inspiration from the 404 Jeffrey. But I guess the reason it's not in my top 5 is it's not as cut and dry. For instance, every cartridge based on the 30-06 has the same head diameter and the same basic geometry, other than some minor neck length or some very small measurement. It's basically the same geometry, just a different caliber. But with the 404 Jeffrey, a lot of cartridges kind of took it and was inspired by it, but they're not all the same. The WSM and the Psalm, the Rum, and also they're not exactly the same. They don't all have the same rim diameter. They don't all have the same width of the body of the case. Of course, they're different lengths. That's not really the issue, but they're just not exactly the same. So it appears they were inspired by the same cartridge, but not in such a direct lineage. And the 404 Jeffrey in itself is nothing spectacular. I think that they just, so I think around the year 1998 up until this current moment, in a lot of modern cartridge design, when we're talking about Magnum cartridges, I think people have kind of moved away from the belted Magnum, so that 375 case is not being used as much. And they might not have wanted quite such a big case as the 416 Rigby, but something just slightly smaller and beltless, and so that 404 Jeffrey was a good choice. But I wouldn't say that it in itself is a great cartridge design. It was just a good overall size to inspire other cartridges. And then one more that I'll give the honorable mention to is the WSM cartridges. If this was my personal list, this would be definitely on the top 5. I guess it is my personal list, but I'm trying to be as objective as I can. But the WSMs, even though they're kind of part of that family tree coming from the 404 Jeffrey, or at least inspired by it, they in themselves, I think, including the 6.8 Western, are really a great overall case. Very strong, high pressure case, great shoulder angle. A lot of really good things about that WSM case. So that'll be the honorable mention. All right, without any further ado, number 5 is the 284 Winchester. Talked about the 284 Winchester or the 6.5 284 many times on my channel, so I don't need to go really in depth with it. But basically, they decided, Winchester, that they wanted to duplicate the performance of the 270 Winchester and the 280 Remington, but in a short action. It's bordering on short. I might talk about that later, but it's just barely still fits in a short action. It basically is got the same head diameter as the 30-06 cases, but it's a little bit wider at the base of the cartridge. Therefore, the rim is rebated. So the rim is a little smaller than the base of the cartridge. To my knowledge, that's the first cartridge to do that. Not a lot of taper in the case. It's not full-on accurately improved, but it's very similar, just not a lot of body taper. And then it has a 35-degree shoulder angle, which once again, not full-on accurately 40-degree, but still a very cool, in my opinion, 35-degree shoulder angle, which once again, I believe was the first cartridge to have that. And it basically, even though it's shorter, it duplicates the performance of the 280 Remington. There could be, you know, minor differences, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same. And it has pretty near the same case capacity, even though it appears to be a little smaller because it's shorter and fatter. And it really is the first short mag case. Cartridges obviously have got much shorter and much fatter since the 284, but it really was and one of the first cartridges, in my opinion, the first that really went for that short mag philosophy. Some notable children to the 284 is the 6.5 284, the 450 Bushmaster, and more recently the 6.5 Weatherby RPM and the 338 Weatherby RPM, just lengthened a little bit. All right, number 4, the 222 Remington. I didn't mention on the 284, but it's really, besides in the F-class world, it's just obsolete. It's more, its legacy is gone after it. The 222 is very similar. It's not 100% obsolete, but it's not common at all. There are a few rifle manufacturers that do chamber a few models in it, but for the most part, it's been replaced by one of its children, which is the 223 or the 5.56. The 222 is known as being a deadly accurate cartridge, and at one time might have been the most accurate cartridge that people knew of. Obviously, its range is not extreme because it's just a 22, but a very efficient, very balanced, very nice, and very accurate cartridge in a small package with a small rifle primer. And you know, it was just much better than anything at the time. It was much better than the 22 Hornet. It wasn't the speed demon of the 220 Swift, but it was probably a lot more accurate and definitely easier to shoot, and just overall a really big success. Of course, it spawned the 223, which pretty much has just replaced it as the cartridge that has become, you know, obviously in the M16 and the M4, and it's still around today in our military. And then, of course, the 17 Remington comes from that. The 221 Fireball is another child, the 300 Blackout. The 222 Remington Magnum, and then later the 204 Ruger was based on the 222 Remington Magnum. So it's got quite a lineage. And in that small rifle primer case design, in that smaller world of rifle cartridges, it really is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, case design. All right, number 3, 308 Winchester. What can you say about the 308 Winchester? You know, it was made to replace the 30-06 for military use, and it did that. And it's pretty much everything it's attempted, it's done perfectly. It's a great hunting cartridge. It's a great long-range target shooting cartridge. I always use the word balance. It's just a very balanced cartridge when it comes to power versus recoil, when it comes to energy versus velocity. It just seems to be it's just good at everything. Has a 20-degree shoulder angle and has a little bit of taper, but not a lot, but it feeds exceptionally well. It obviously was made to be used in machine guns as well, so it had to feed good. And it basically is a 30-06, but shortened and made more efficient. It's not gonna have the same potential as a 30-06, but it's just a shorter, more compact, more efficient version of it. Absolute home run is a 308. Home run. And then every spawn, well, I guess not every child of it is a home run, but they're all good. There's nothing that comes from the 308 that isn't really good. The 243 is probably the next most popular. It's just an unbelievable popular, great dual cartridge round between, say, deer and coyote. It's just that perfect middle ground. I mean, it is the king of 6mm, though the 6mm Remington, the 6mm Creedmoor, the 6 Arc, in some ways might be superior, but they never get close to knocking off the king of the 6mm, which is that 243. It's just amazing. Neck it down to 7mm and you have one of the best all-around cartridges of all, unless you're getting into the really big game. Not that it couldn't do it, but it might not be ideal. But that 7mm 08, just an amazing cartridge. It also, like its parent, is great at long-range target shooting. It's great at hunting. It's just great at everything. You cannot go wrong with the 7mm 08, nor the 260 Remington. The only flaw really in the design of the 260 was the twist rate that they chose to go with it. I believe it was 1 in 9. It really should have been 1 in 8. But the 260 Remington is an amazing cartridge. And whether you're talking about the 338 Federal, the 358 Winchester, none of its offspring are bad. In fact, they're all really good and very efficient. It's probably one of the most efficient cases ever designed. Fits perfectly into that short action. In fact, I'd say our modern day short actions are designed with the 308 case in mind. Number 2, the 375 H&H. I'm not even gonna go through all the cartridges that came from the 375 H&H or the 300 H&H. I'm just gonna show it on the screen now. So you see how ridiculous this is. I mean, I can't think of another cartridge that has as many children and as many offspring as this 375 H&H. Which is why but almost all your Weatherby cartridges have a belt. It's why your 7 Rem Mag has a belt. Your 300 Rem Mag has a belt. Your 264, your 8mm Remington, so on and so forth. They all have a belt because they're all based on that 375 H&H. You know, it's so close to the number 1 spot that I almost put it number 1 just from the sheer volume of cartridges that came from it. But basically, if you wanted a little extra and you wanted to create a Magnum for basically over a half century, this was the cartridge you started with, and then you made your little tweaks to it. But this cartridge is an absolute legend, and it's still around today. In fact, it's one of the most common cartridges in Africa. When you're hunting the Big 5 in Africa, it's basically the minimum cartridge. It's still chambered in basically every rifle manufacturer today if they're chambering an African-style rifle model. It's still popular, it's still amazing, it still works. Is it the best cartridge design for me personally? No, it's not. It's not what I would create today, which I'll get to that here in a minute. But man, its lineage, its legacy is just unparalleled. Except for maybe one other one, and that would be the number 1, which is a 30-06. Now, the 30-06 came from a cartridge, the 7mm Mauser, but it is quite a bit different. It not only just was necked up, it is different in its geometry, though it carries over that same rim diameter, same base diameter. It is much longer, and it's made for that standard or long action, whereas the 7 Mauser is kind of an intermediate length, kind of like the 284. The 30-06 is just perfect for a long action. In fact, anytime, whether you're talking about Nosler cartridges, whether you're talking about the 7 Rim Mag, the 300 Win Mag, so many cartridges today, 375 Ruger, really try to keep their limitations down to that 3.340 overall length, which is, by the way, the 30-06 overall length. So in the same way, when you think of short action, you kind of think of a 308. When you think of a long action or standard action, you think of the 30-06. 30-06 is so common, so popular for so long that many cartridge designers just simply go with that overall length because they already know that there's so many manufacturers already making rifles with those actions and magazines in mind that it's going to work. So it's just a very common overall length. The 30-06, of course, was designed by the military in the Springfield Armory. The original 30-06 was designed with like a 150 grain bullet in mind. Of course, today, you know, we're using anywhere from 110 to 220, maybe 230 grain bullets, depending on the ogive and the ballistic coefficients and all that. It's very versatile, extremely versatile, in fact. Still holds up today. It got us through 2 world wars, whether it was in the 1903 Springfield as our normal, you know, standard battle rifle, or whether it became the M1 Garand and then the Springfield was used as a sniper, or whether it was put into some kind of machine gun, the Browning machine gun. It's just the cartridge of choice. It's to this day, you grab a 30-06, you're pretty well good for anything in North America. You got amazingly popular cartridges like the 270 Winchester, the 25-06, the 280 Remington, the 6.5 A square, the 338 A square, the 35 Whelen. All these cartridges basically just come from that 30-06, just necking it up or down. I had to give it the nod over the 308 simply because the 308 really is just a 30-06 but shortened and made more efficient. But you know, it's the back half, the 308 and the 30-06 are exactly the same thing. They just changed a few things, made it shorter, more efficient, lighter to carry for, you know, like bags of ammunition. And so really the 308 comes from the 30-06 to some degree. And even though the 375 H&H has so many more offspring than the 30-06, it's pretty close. But man, that 30-06 I think just appeals to a broader range of people, not just hunters that want Magnum cartridges, but just a lot of people in a lot of different disciplines of shooting. So I will give it to the 30-06. All right, now let me go down a quick little road here of my personal thoughts. So Ron, a viewer and subscriber of mine, he asked me this question about top 5 case designs. And then he asked me another question about if I was going to design my own case right now, what would I go with? And what do I look for in good case design? So I'll just throw out some things. I do like a more steeper shoulder. You know, the 17-degree shoulder angle on a 30-06, not ideal. The 20-degree shoulder angle on 308, not ideal. But keep in mind those things and those cartridges were designed to feed really well, and also in machine guns. And they feed well in semi-autos or any other action you're talking about. So they were designed that way for a reason. So if I was designing a cartridge for semi-auto or machine gun use, or if I was designing a cartridge for big game, like dangerous game, where even a bolt action, where smooth feeding and quick recycling of the bolt was paramount, then I might go with more of a not as steep shoulder angle and more of a gradual taper. But taking those things aside, I'm always going to go with a steeper shoulder angle. Now, my favorite shoulder angle is a 35-degree shoulder angle. You know, the Ackley Improved is up there all the way to 40. I love the 280 Ackley Improved. Nothing wrong with it. I think it could be just a hair too much, but I've got no issues with it. But I think 30 to 35 is that sweet spot. And really, 20 to 30 is just fine. And there's nothing wrong, like I said, with a 17 degree on the 30-06. But if you're just having me be the designer, me be the developer, I'm definitely going to go with either 30 or 35. And my personal pick would be 35-degree shoulder angle. When it comes to taper, I don't like a lot of taper. So you look at a 300 H&H here, I'll put it on the screen, that's a lot of taper. Even though I'm a big fan of the 22-250 and its parent, which was the 250 3000 Savage, I don't care much for that extreme taper. Trust me, it's not going to do any harm. It's just fine. It's a piddly thing on my part. But I don't want it to have zero taper, because then it's going to have trouble feeding. Okay, it needs some taper, but minimal taper. And it needs a steep shoulder angle, but not extremely steep. So I think that, you know, that body taper of, say, a 308, a 284, or any of your new WSM and Nosler cartridges, I just think even your Weatherby cartridges, they're pretty good. That kind of more modern body taper is ideal for me. And then that 35-degree shoulder angle is what I personally prefer. So currently cartridges that have 35-degree shoulder angles, once again, starting with the 284 and any cartridge based on the 284, all the WSMs and all the Noslers. So those cartridges have 35-degree shoulder angles. I'm a fan. Rim diameter to me doesn't mean a whole lot. I don't really care. If it's rebated, like the 284s, it doesn't bother me. If it's not rebated, like a 308, it's fine. It is nice to have all of them kind of be a 473 diameter, but it doesn't have to be. A WSM with the, I think it's 535 or no, 550. Like the PRCs, I believe, have a 532 rim diameter. It really doesn't matter to me. I don't really care. The only thing when you're having to reload, if the rim diameter is different, you got to get all new stuff. You got to get all new shell holders and different things like that, but not a big deal. Neck length. I definitely have a preference on neck length. It's not the be-all end-all, and I've had multiple people comment on my videos and say it doesn't affect anything, and I don't disagree. I think they're right. But hey, this is me designing my own cartridge, and so I like a neck length at least as long as the diameter or the caliber of the bullet. So if it's a 30 caliber bullet, which is .308, I want my neck length also to be .308. It just seems to be a good number and gives it plenty of surface there to hold that bullet. Especially some of your VLD bullets, you know, they're just so long and tapered, and their ogive is so far back that you just don't have a ton of surface there, but you definitely want to get as much as possible held within that neck. And so if you do have a real long, high BC VLD style bullet and then have a really short neck, it's really, in my opinion, not ideal for it to be sitting in there. And the other thing about a neck that I love, about a long neck that I love, is it is keeping the bullet out of the taking up case capacity. So more of the bullet is in the neck and not down in the case capacity. That can be an issue with your WSMs or your 308s. If you go with the heaviest, like a 220 grain bullet in the 308, you can definitely do it, but it's way down in your case because it's just not designed for that. And it's in that case, no pun intended, it's not because of the neck length so much, it's because of the short action or the magazine length and the short head height. All right, which brings me to my next topic, is head height. So 20 years ago, when I was looking into cartridges and what cartridges I might want to have a gunsmith build as a custom rifle for me, one thing I was thinking about way back then was having that bullet seated out pretty far and getting as close to the lands as possible. And so when he would chamber and ream that barrel, I would always tell him, hey, make sure that you leave plenty of head height. I don't think I called it that back then, but I just wanted to make sure I could seat that bullet out pretty far. And some case designs just don't call for that. So when a manufacturer, a developer submits the data sheet, the specs to SAMI, it's not just for the cartridge case dimensions and overall length, it's also for the chamber design. So I do like the chamber designs of the Creedmoor cases. I think starting way back with like that 204 Ruger, 30 TC, 375 Ruger, some of their very first designs, they kind of come up with that tight tolerances, like a match grade chamber, and also a high head height going along with the fast twist rate for those heavier high BC bullets. I do prefer that, generally speaking. I just don't want to have to cram my bullet way down deep in the case or be, you know, restricted to using only lighter weight bullets that aren't long. I don't want to have to do that. So I prefer high head height, and I prefer a decently long neck. It doesn't have to be extremely long. Then you got to think about action length and magazine lengths. For instance, I think they've maybe adjusted this on the new 700s, but I know the old Remington Model 700s, their short action rifles, had a magazine length of like 2.8 inches or something like that. And then a Winchester Model 70 short action had more like 3 inch. Well, if you're shooting an intermediate length cartridge like a 284, 300 WSM, 7mm Mauser, that's gonna fit much better into a 3 inch magazine than say a 2.8 inch. And so you just got to think about, if I take a short action cartridge, but then I'm doing so many things to give it a little bit more power, a little bit more case capacity, a little bit heavier bullet, that I'm going so far that it's really not going to fit properly into a short action. Have I went too far? Is it going to fit? Are you going to have to seat that bullet down in the case? Are you not going to be able to put your bullets in your magazine? Are you going to have to single feed? Something to think about. That's why I'm a big fan of the Mauser 98 actions. They're that intermediate length action. I'm also a fan of, Savage has 6.5 284s you can buy, and they just put them in a long action. I think that's a great idea. Just put it in a long action, then you got plenty of room. So action length is definitely something I would consider. Now, if I had all the money in the world, had my own company, and I could build whatever I wanted, I would do something like a intermediate length action. I mean, I would have 3. I'd have short, intermediate, and long action, and Magnum. I'm sorry, I'd have 4. Similar to what Montana Rifle Company did. I'm not sure if they're still around, but they used to have, I think it was a model 1999, and they had it like in a 270 WSM, and it had an intermediate length action. It was like 3.1, 3.2 inches. So if you have an intermediate length action, a lot of my favorite cartridges like the 284 and the WSM cartridges with a long bullet and a fast twist rate would be ideal. But for the sake of this video, that's just not really practical. You're just not gonna find a whole lot of that. And outside of just a few niche brands and custom rifles, you're pretty much restricted to short, long, or Magnum. So for the sake of this video, let's just focus on those. A cartridge and case design that would fit good within those action lengths. As I'm making this video, I realized I could talk for 2 hours about this. And I can tell you about 50 cool designs that are in my head that I think would be slight, variations of existing cartridges, but I would think would be just ideal and I would really like. But I can't take that long of a video. So I'm going to try to wrap this up. I think, and I've said this before when I talked about 7mm 08, 280 Ackley Improved, 7 PRC, 6.8 Western, I just think that 7mm or 270 is really close to 7mm. That 7mm caliber is just about the ideal overall. You could make a case for 30 caliber being better overall, but I just think for the most balanced overall bullet, we're just going to go with a 7mm. So then that'll kind of cut out a lot of this, make it a little shorter, so we can just focus on my ideal cartridge designs, all being 7mm. Whenever Ron posed this question, the first thing I thought of was taking the 7mm 08 and the 284 and putting them together. Because both of those cartridges I think are amazing. The only issue, once again, we're focusing on short or long, not intermediate. The only issue with the 284 is you'd probably be better off to go long action, but maybe something like the 7PRC is just going to be better for that. So if it's regulated to short action, it's just a hair too long. It can definitely fit in a short action, but I don't think it's ideal. So I'm thinking, take that 284 case and take about 2/10 of an inch out of the main body length of the case. That's going to shorten it about to the same length as a 7mm 08. However, because the 284 is rebated, it's wider and has more case capacity. It also has a 35-degree shoulder angle versus a 20-degree shoulder angle. Once again, more case capacity. But cutting it down that much is going to be able for you to still get a pretty high BC long weight bullet extending out. Definitely needs to have at least a 284 length neck on it, if not a little longer. And I really think you could just get the ideal short action cartridge if you did that. You basically have like a shortened 284. And in fact, if you think about it, Winchester kind of just did that, but they took the 270 short mag, did pretty much exactly what I just said, and came up with the 6.8 Western. So props on Winchester. Though I'm a huge fan of the 270 WSM, I could definitely see why that was an improvement to some degree. As I'm thinking about this last night, I was Googling it and I thought, I wonder if anyone's ever thought of this before. And sure enough, I found a post where someone talked about what they called the 284 short Shehane. If you know what a Shehane is, it's just a 284 with the cartridge blew out just a little bit. It's just a little bit wider than the normal 284, and therefore it holds a little bit more case capacity. You can get that bullet going just a little bit faster. And he came up with the idea of just do that, but then shorten it, make it fit really nice and neat into a short action, and call it the 284 short Shehane. So I'm not the first to think of this. But then I got to thinking about, if you're wanting it to be just a little bit fatter than the normal 284, you might as well go up to the PRC case. And then I thought, yeah, that's kind of exactly what the 6.5 PRC is. It already has done that. It's just a little bit shorter than the 284, a little bit wider than the 284 or the 7mm 08. But yet it has enough room. The overall length is like 2.955 for the 6.5 PRC, and I think it's the same for the 6.8 Western. And so that's what my overall length would be, being around 2.95. And you're just at the outer extremes of a short action, but it still fits in the magazine. And so then I thought, well, then you could just take that 6.5 PRC, neck it up to 7mm, but that's already been done too. In fact, if you know Eric Cortina, he's won 2 recent tournaments, one over in, I believe, Africa, and one here in the Southwest of America, where he basically used that. He used a 6mm PRC necked up to 7mm. Some would call it a 7.65 PRC. Others, I think he calls it a 7 PRCW or Wheeler. So that's kind of already been done, but man, that's a great thought too. So I think if I wanted it to be a little fatter than the 284, I would just go up to that 7.65 PRC. So I think either one of those would work, but I'm going to stick with the 284 because I like that shoulder angle. I like that 35-degree shoulder angle. And I don't mind the rebated rim. I'm A-okay with that. It's got the same rim diameter as a 30-06. So really, the 7.65 PRC or the 6.5 PRC itself, the 6.8 Western, all kind of fall in the same category and we'd be just about perfect. But if it was me, I'd just take that 284, take 2/10 of an inch out of it, shorten it down, Obviously keep the 35-degree shoulder angle, and it basically would be a 7mm 08 plus P. It would just be the same thing, have a 1 in 8 twister 8, and it would be able to shoot like a 175 grain bullet, or down. Obviously you can go all the way down to 120 grains, and I think it would be just perfect for a short action. I'll call that the 7mm short HB for hopeful ballistics. So if a gunsmith makes a Wildcat of that, that's what you should call it. I'm kidding. So then I got to thinking about a long action, you know. Now you could just take the 284 case and make it longer, which by the way is exactly what a 6.5 Weatherby RPM is. Just neck it up to 7mm. But then I got to thinking about it, as cool as that is, or say a 280 Ackley improved. So in my opinion, a 6.5 or 7mm RPM or a 280 Ackley improved are two more cartridges that are almost perfect. But in reality, I think that PRC is just a little better. It's very similar case, very similar overall length, but just a little fatter, hold a little bit more case capacity. It's already set up with everything that I've mentioned I like, except the shoulder angle. So I would take the current 7 PRC exactly the way it is, give it a 35-degree shoulder angle, and I think it would be just about ideal. Which, by the way, is very similar to what a Nosler case is, except for the Nosler cases are just a little bit bigger. So this might make some of you mad, but some of you happy, I don't know. But I think that 7mm PRC case is 99 out of 100 when it comes to the way it was designed. I think I told someone this before, but I was kind of thinking of something similar to that for a long time. And then when it came out and I read everything about it, I'm like, that's pretty much exactly the cartridge I would design for a standard or long length action. And man, it's just about perfect. 284, 7 rim mag, 280 Ackley improved, they're all right there with it. But man, that 7 PRC is just about perfect. I would just give it a 35-degree shoulder angle. So that should kind of explain to you the way I think about cartridges. Now please don't think I am against any cartridges. I like them all. I mean, I'll put some pictures of cartridge on the screen, like the 22 Hornet. It's ridiculously long neck for no reason. Weird taper and shoulder angle. Not a fan of its design. I used to have a 22 Hornet. It's a blast to shoot. I love a 22 Hornet. Same with a 30-30. Really weird design. Very fun to shoot 30-30. So don't think I'm against any cartridge just because it ain't my favorite. But if you asked me to design, it would be something like that short 284 that I talked about. And man, the 7 PRC is just about perfect. So I'll end the video with this. Even to this day, the 30-06 is still adequate. It's still relevant. It's still popular. It's still successful. It's still an amazing cartridge. And so, wow. I mean, it's really hard to beat such an amazing cartridge. So props to the 30-06. Thank you, Ron, for this idea of a video. And we'll just leave it there. And until next time, guys, take care.